The eviction notice was already taped to the door when I came home from work, curling at the edges like it had been waiting on me to arrive so it could finish the job. I stood there longer than I should have, keys clenched in my fist, staring at my own name printed in bold letters like an accusation. Final notice. I felt the blood drain from my face before my mind even caught up. 3 days. That's all they were giving me. 3 days to undo months of sacrifice, years of loyalty, and a love that had quietly turned my life into collateral. Inside the apartment, everything looked the same. The couch I paid for, the TV I financed, the kitchen table where I balanced bills late at night while he slept peacefully in the bedroom. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat down slowly, my chest tightening like it knew something I'd been refusing to admit. I called him, straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't need to. I already knew where he was, somewhere warm, somewhere paid for, somewhere untouched by the consequences he'd left behind. I replayed it all like a movie I could no longer pause. The first time he said he was short on rent. Just this once, baby. The utilities he forgot to pay. The car note he promised he'd catch up on. Every time I reached into my savings, I told myself it was temporary, that love meant patience, that partnership meant carrying the weight when the other person stumbled. No one warned me that sometimes they don't stumble. Sometimes they lean. By the time the relationship ended, my savings account was a memory and my credit score was a joke. He walked away clean. No debt, no eviction, no shame. I stayed behind with bills addressed to me, balances I didn't recognize, and silence where accountability should have been. The landlord didn't care about love. The bank didn't care about loyalty, and patience didn't mean a thing when rent was due. The night before I had to leave, I packed my life into my car, clothes folded tight, shoes stuffed into bags, personal things I couldn't replace wedged wherever they fit. I sat in the driver's seat afterward, engine off, staring at the dark building that used to feel like home. I didn't cry then. Shock has a way of numbing you first. I told myself it was just temporary, a few nights on couches, a reset. I didn't tell anyone the truth, not my friends, not my coworkers. Shame has a voice, and it told me to keep quiet, to smile, to pretend I wasn't unraveling. By the third night, couches ran out. That's when I slept in my car for the first time. I parked somewhere quiet, leaned the seat back as far as it would go, and stared at the ceiling while tears slid silently into my hair. Every sound outside felt amplified. Every shadow felt threatening. I wrapped my coat around myself and tried to breathe through the panic clawing at my chest. This was my reward for loving too hard, for believing sacrifice was noble, for confusing loyalty with self-erasure. I checked my bank balance one last time that night, the screen glowing cruel and small. 2 digits. That was it. Everything I had left in the world fit on a phone screen and the back seat of my car. I thought about all the times I ignored that tight feeling in my stomach, the red flags dressed up as excuses, the way my needs always came second because I thought love meant endurance. Lying there in the dark, I finally let the truth land, heavy and undeniable. Love didn't bankrupt me. I did, by staying too long, by paying too much, by believing patience could fix exploitation. And as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft colors that felt unfairly beautiful, I made myself a promise through clenched teeth and a broken heart. If I survived this, I would never confuse love with a financial trap again. But at that moment, survival was still uncertain because I had no home, no savings, no backup plan. And the hardest part was knowing the man who helped put me here was sleeping peacefully, completely untouched by the wreckage he left behind. Sleeping in your car teaches you how exposed you really are. The first night, I kept telling myself it was temporary, a fluke, a bad chapter I'd laugh about later. By the second night, my body stopped believing the lies my mouth kept repeating. My back ached from the awkward angle. My neck throbbed. Every time headlights passed, my heart jumped like I'd done something wrong just by existing there. I learned quickly how to disappear. I parked in different places each night so no one would notice patterns. Grocery store lots, hospital streets, anywhere people came and went enough that I blended into the background. I brushed my teeth in gas station bathrooms, splashing water on my face and practicing a smile in the mirror so coworkers wouldn't ask questions I couldn't answer. During the day, I functioned. That was the scariest part. I went to work. I laughed at jokes. I answered emails. I nodded when people complained about their partners leaving dishes in the sink or forgetting anniversaries. No one knew I was calculating how long I could sit in air conditioning without being noticed. No one knew my trunk held my entire life. At night, the truth came back. I replayed conversations I should have taken seriously. The way he'd sigh dramatically when bills came up. The way he always had an excuse but never a plan. The way my stomach tightened every time I opened my banking app. Not because I didn't trust myself, but because I didn't trust him. I had trusted him anyway, because love, I thought, meant not keeping score. I thought about the first time I covered rent for him. He looked embarrassed, promised it wouldn't happen again. He cooked dinner that night, kissed my forehead, thanked me like gratitude could replace responsibility. I remember feeling proud of myself, proud to be the strong one, proud to be dependable. No one tells you how dangerous it is when someone gets comfortable with your sacrifice. By the time I realized I was carrying us both, it felt too late to stop without feeling cruel, and cruelty, I'd been taught, was worse than self-destruction. On the fourth night in my car, I woke up to someone knocking on the window. My heart nearly exploded out of my chest. A security guard, polite, firm, telling me I couldn't sleep there. I apologized too many times, my voice shaking as I pulled away and found another spot. Shame burned hot and sharp in my throat. I felt like a child being scolded for something I didn't know how to fix. I cried that night. Not loud, not dramatically, just quiet tears sliding down my face while I stared at the steering wheel. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who believed love protected you. I cried for the version of me who ignored her intuition because she didn't want to seem difficult. I checked my phone and saw a message from him. Just one line. Hope you're okay. That was it. No apology, no accountability, no offer to help. I didn't respond. That was the first boundary I'd set in months, maybe years. It felt small, but it mattered. I was done explaining my pain to someone who benefited from my silence. The next morning, I made a decision that scared me more than sleeping in my car. I asked for help. I called a coworker I trusted and told her the truth, not all of it, but enough. She listened quietly, then said, "You can stay on my couch for a few nights." I thanked her like she'd handed me oxygen. Pride can suffocate you if you let it. Those nights on her couch were safer, but the shame followed me there too. I folded my blankets neatly every morning, cleaned obsessively, tried to make myself as invisible as possible. I didn't want to take up space. I didn't want to be a burden. That word again. Burden. It echoed in my head every time I opened my budgeting app and saw nothing but red. Late fees, overdrafts, notices piling up. I realized then that love hadn't just drained my savings, it had trained me to accept instability as normal. I couldn't afford that lesson anymore. One evening, while scrolling through job listings and financial advice forums, I came across a sentence that stopped me cold. If love should add to your life, not subtract from your future. I read it over and over. something shifted. For the first time, I stopped asking how to fix what had happened and started asking how to prevent it from ever happening again. I started tracking every dollar, no matter how small. I picked up extra shifts. I stopped romanticizing struggle and started naming it for what it was. Exploitation. That word felt harsh, uncomfortable, necessary. Because the truth was this: he hadn't loved me too much. He loved what I provided. And sitting there on that borrowed couch, laptop balanced on my knees, I felt something unfamiliar but powerful rise up in me. Clarity. Painful. Unforgiving. Freeing. I didn't know yet how long rebuilding would take. I didn't know where I'd land. I didn't know how deep the damage really went. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done paying love with my future. And the next part of this journey would force me to confront just how deeply I'd been conditioned to confuse sacrifice with devotion, and how hard it would be to unlearn it. Unlearning is harder than surviving. Survival is instinct. You don't think, you react. You move because you have to. But unlearning? That requires sitting still long enough to face the patterns you helped normalize. And that's where the real pain lives. Once I wasn't sleeping in my car every night, the adrenaline faded. That's when the exhaustion hit, deep, bone heavy. I'd lie awake on my coworker's couch, staring at the ceiling fan, replaying moments I used to excuse without a second thought. The time he borrowed my credit card for groceries and somehow bought sneakers. The time he said paying the electric bill was on his list while the lights flickered. The way he'd joke about me being the responsible one, like it was a compliment instead of a warning. I used to laugh along, because I thought love meant flexibility. I thought partnership meant absorbing the cracks. I thought being chosen meant being needed. No one told me how dangerous that belief could be. I started writing everything down, not just numbers, but memories. I needed to see the pattern outside my head. And once it was on paper, there was no unseeing it. Every entry followed the same rhythm. His crisis, my solution. His apology, my patience. His comfort, my depletion. I wasn't unlucky. I was conditioned to overgive, conditioned to carry more than my share, conditioned to believe endurance was a virtue. That realization knocked the wind out of me, because if this wasn't just bad luck, then it meant I had a role in my own collapse. Not blame, responsibility. And responsibility is terrifying when you're already exhausted. I picked up extra shifts wherever I could. Early mornings, late nights, weekends that bled together. I didn't tell myself it was temporary anymore. I told myself it was necessary. Every dollar had a job now. Gas, food, minimum payments. I learned how fast money disappears when you're recovering from someone else's mess. One night, while calculating how long it would take to clear just one overdue account, my chest tightened again. That familiar panic crept in, the kind that makes your hands go numb and your thoughts race. I put the calculator down, sat on the floor, and breathed. That was new. Before, panic sent me running to fix, to pay, to smooth things over. This time, I stayed with it, named it, let it pass without making another sacrifice to silence it. That moment felt small, but it wasn't. It was the first time I chose regulation over reaction. I started reading, not love stories, not motivational quotes, but real things. Articles about financial abuse, stories from women who'd lost homes, savings, years to partners who contributed nothing but promises. I recognized myself in every paragraph. The shame loosened its grip when I realized how common this was. It wasn't weakness, it was social training. I created rules for myself, simple ones at first. No co-signing, no covering recurring expenses that weren't mine, no sacrificing stability for potential. Writing them down made my stomach flip. They felt harsh, unromantic, necessary. When he tried calling again, and he did, I let it ring. Watching his name disappear from the screen without answering felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. He texted later, then again, then stopped. Silence stretched. In that space, I heard my own thoughts clearly for the first time in years, and what they said wasn't kind, but it was honest. You were afraid to be alone. You were afraid to disappoint. You were afraid to be seen as selfish. So you paid with money, with security, with your future. I didn't beat myself up for it. I couldn't afford that either. Instead, I asked a harder question. Who taught me this? The answer wasn't just him. It was every message I absorbed about being a good woman, about holding things down, about standing by your man, about loyalty being measured by how much you're willing to lose. That realization burned because it meant rebuilding wasn't just about money, it was about identity. I wasn't just broke, I was disentangling myself from a belief system that had nearly destroyed me. And as painful as that was, it came with power, because if beliefs can bankrupt you, then new ones can save you. I didn't know yet how long it would take to rebuild fully. I didn't know when stability would stop feeling fragile, but I knew this much. The woman who went broke trying to prove her love was gone, and the woman who was learning to protect her future had just begun to speak. The next step would test that voice, not with loneliness, not with fear, but with temptation. And I wasn't sure yet if I was strong enough to resist it. Temptation doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like familiarity. It showed up one afternoon when my phone buzzed while I was on my lunch break, sitting in my car with a protein bar and a notebook full of numbers. His name lit up the screen like a ghost I hadn't invited, but somehow expected. I stared at it longer than I should have. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was relief, muscle memory, the part of me that had been trained to soothe, to fix, to make things easier for everyone else, leaned forward without asking permission. I didn't answer, but my heart raced like I had. He texted a few minutes later. "Can we talk? I've been thinking about everything." That line used to work every time. I felt the old pull, the urge to explain how much he'd hurt me, to hear him say the right words, to believe closure would make this ache disappear. I told myself I was stronger now, but strength doesn't erase habit, it challenges it. I went back to my notebook. Numbers don't lie. Patterns don't apologize, and memory, when written down, doesn't soften itself. I flipped to the page where I'd listed everything I'd paid for during the last year of the relationship. Rent, utilities, groceries, phone bill, emergency loans that were never repaid. I added it up again, even though I already knew the total. Seeing it there kept me grounded. He texted again. "I just want to make sure you're okay." I laughed once quietly, bitterly, because if he truly wanted to make sure I was okay, he wouldn't have been okay letting me drown while he stayed afloat. That realization landed harder than any insult ever could. I typed out a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I sent one sentence. "I'm not available for this conversation." My hands shook when I hit send. Boundaries aren't loud. They don't come with applause. They come with fear. Fear of being misunderstood, rejected, labeled cold. But they also come with relief if you let them. He didn't respond. The silence felt different this time. Not empty, clean. That night, lying on the couch with my coat folded under my head like a pillow, I felt the weight of that choice settle in. I hadn't fixed anything, I hadn't gotten answers, but I also hadn't reopened the wound. Progress doesn't always feel like forward motion. Sometimes it feels like standing still while your instincts scream at you to go back to what's familiar. The next few weeks tested me in quieter ways. Bills arrived with red stamps and tight deadlines. My budget barely stretched far enough to cover minimum payments. Some nights I sat in the dark with my laptop open, wondering if all this effort would ever catch up to the damage already done. There were moments, honest ones, where I questioned whether love was worth this kind of discipline, whether I'd swung too far in the other direction, whether being careful meant being closed. But every time that doubt crept in, I remembered the eviction notice. I remembered the car, the cold, the way my stomach dropped when I checked my balance. Stability isn't romantic, but neither is homelessness. I started setting small, unglamorous goals. Pay this bill on time, save $50, say no this week without apologizing, celebrate progress quietly without needing anyone else to validate it. Something shifted. I began to trust myself again. Not the version of me that hoped people would change, but the version of me that paid attention when they didn't. I learned that discernment isn't bitterness, it's wisdom earned the hard way. One evening, my coworker sat beside me on the couch and asked gently, "Do you miss him?" I thought about it. I miss who I thought he was, but I don't miss who I became trying to save him. That truth felt like a door closing behind me. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how long rebuilding would take, but I knew I was no longer willing to negotiate my safety for affection. And just when I started to feel steady, just when routine replaced chaos, life presented me with a new challenge. Not him, but another opportunity to overextend myself. And this time, the cost of saying yes would reveal just how deeply I changed, or how much work I still had left to do. The opportunity came disguised as responsibility. It was a coworker this time, not a man I loved, not a relationship wrapped in romance, but someone I respected, someone struggling. She pulled me aside near the time clock one evening, her voice low, eyes tired in a way I recognized immediately. "Maya, I hate to ask," she said, already apologizing, "but I'm short on rent this month, just until next paycheck. I know you're good with money." That last part hit me harder than it should have. Good with money. I almost laughed, if only she knew. My first instinct rose up fast and familiar, the urge to help, to be the solution, to prove I was dependable. That old identity still lived in me, waiting for an excuse to reassert itself. My mouth opened before my mind caught up. "How much?" I asked. The number wasn't small. It would wipe out the thin cushion I'd been building dollar by dollar, the emergency fund that wasn't even worthy of the name yet, the money that stood between me and another car seat turned bed. I felt the room tilt slightly. In the past, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have told myself it was temporary, that generosity always came back around, that being there for people was who I was. But now, a new voice spoke up, quieter, steadier. "You can't afford this. Not emotionally, not financially, not spiritually." I told her I needed to think about it. That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation. The guilt crept in first. She had kids. She worked hard. She wasn't exploiting me. She was just desperate. Saying no felt cruel. It felt like becoming the kind of woman I'd been taught not to be. But then another memory surfaced. Me sitting in my car, knees pressed to the dashboard, wondering how generosity had landed me there. I opened my budget. Numbers stared back at me, unemotional and unforgiving. Every dollar had already been assigned a job: survival, recovery, protection. There was no extra without consequence. Lending her money wouldn't be kindness, it would be self-betrayal. The next day, I pulled her aside again. "I can't," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I'm still rebuilding." Her face fell, just for a moment, then she nodded. "I understand," she said softly. No anger, no manipulation, just disappointment, manageable, human. I exhaled for the first time in hours. That was the moment I realized something important. Not everyone punishes you for having boundaries. Some people simply adjust. The world didn't end. She didn't hate me. I didn't collapse. I went back to my station feeling lighter and heavier, because with every boundary comes clarity, and clarity forces you to see how often you've been setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. As the weeks passed, my life settled into a rhythm that felt almost foreign. Work, extra shifts, budget reviews on Sunday nights, quiet evenings reading instead of spiraling. I tracked my progress obsessively at first, then less so as consistency replaced urgency. One afternoon, I checked my credit score and stared at the screen, blinking. It had gone up. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but enough to matter. Enough to remind me that discipline compounds just like debt does, only in the opposite direction. That night, I allowed myself something new. Pride. Not the loud, performative kind, but the private satisfaction of knowing I was doing the work no one could see. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. Still, rebuilding didn't erase loneliness. There were nights I wanted companionship, someone to talk to, someone to lean on. The temptation to date crept in quietly, especially when I felt stable enough to believe I could handle it this time. I downloaded an app. Just browsing, I told myself. Profiles blurred together until one made me pause. Kind eyes, steady job, family-oriented. He messaged first. Polite, attentive, interested without being pushy. My stomach fluttered, a reaction I hadn't felt in a long time. We talked for days, then weeks, nothing intense, nothing demanding, and that somehow made it feel safer. He asked about my work, my goals, my boundaries. He didn't rush, he didn't pressure. When he suggested meeting for coffee, I hesitated, not out of fear, but awareness. I asked myself questions I'd never asked before. Does this add peace or threaten it? Does this person respect your pace? Are you curious or are you lonely? I said yes to coffee. It was pleasant, easy, no fireworks, and for the first time I realized how much I'd confused intensity with connection in the past. We talked about life, not rescue plans. There were no sob stories, no emergencies. On the drive home, I felt proud of myself. But pride can be dangerous if it turns into overconfidence, because just when I started believing I'd mastered discernment, just when I felt certain I could spot red flags from a mile away, something small happened, something subtle, something that would test whether my boundaries were truly internalized or just situational. And how I responded to that moment would determine whether this chapter of my life was truly different or just a calmer version of the same mistake waiting to repeat itself. It started with a comment that sounded harmless. We were sitting at a small cafe, second coffee date, sunlight slanting through the windows like it was trying to bless the moment. He was telling a story about his job, laughing softly, relaxed. I liked that about him, the steadiness, the absence of chaos. Then he said it. I really admire how independent you are, he smiled. It's rare. Makes me feel like you've got things handled. Something in my chest tightened. He didn't mean harm, I could tell. His tone was complimentary, even admiring. Old me would have soaked that up, worn it like a badge of honor. Strong, capable, low maintenance. The kind of woman men leaned on without realizing how much weight they were placing. I smiled back, but my body had already clocked the moment. Later, as we walked to our cars, he mentioned his lease was ending soon. Just in passing. No request, no drama. It's crazy how expensive rent is right now, he said, shaking his head. Makes you appreciate stability. Another harmless sentence, except it wasn't landing harmlessly. That night, alone on my couch, I replayed the conversation the way I trained myself to do now. Not obsessively, but attentively. I wasn't looking for reasons to run. I was looking for patterns. Complimenting my independence, highlighting his housing uncertainty, framing stability as attractive. I felt that old familiar urge stir, the one that whispers, you could help, the one that equates care with contribution, the one that once cost me everything. I didn't act on it. Instead, I asked myself the hardest question yet. If this goes further, what am I afraid would happen if I said no? The answer came quickly. I was afraid he'd lose interest, afraid I'd seem cold, afraid that boundaries would cost me connection. That fear told me everything, because real connection doesn't require prepayment. At our next meeting, I decided to test something, not him, but myself. When he joked, "Must be nice having your life so together," I responded honestly, "It took work, and I'm protected now." He paused, just a second too long. "Yeah," he said slowly, "I get that." But his energy shifted, not dramatically, subtly, less curious, less warm, as if the idea of me being unavailable, not emotionally, but materially, had changed the equation. That was the moment. Not a red flag, a yellow light. And instead of speeding through it like I used to, I stopped. I didn't confront him, I didn't accuse, I simply paid attention. Over the next week, his messages became sporadic, plans were vague, interest cooled without explanation. Old me would have chased clarity. New me let silence speak. It hurt, not deeply, but enough to remind me that growth doesn't mean immunity from disappointment. It means you don't abandon yourself trying to avoid it. I deleted the app a few days later, not because dating was bad, but because I wasn't ready to share space with anyone who hadn't done the work I had. That realization didn't feel lonely. It felt honest. Meanwhile, my life kept improving in quiet, tangible ways. My emergency fund hit a number that made me sit back and exhale. Bills were current. My credit score climbed again, slowly, steadily. One evening, while reviewing my budget, I realized something that made my throat tighten. For the first time in years, no one needed anything from me that I couldn't afford to give, and I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I cooked dinner that night, a real one, not something rushed or cheap, and ate at the table, savoring the calm. Stability tastes different when you've been starving. I thought about love, not the fantasy, not the struggle version, but the real thing. Love should feel safe. Love should feel mutual. Love should never require silence around money. That last one landed hard, because silence is where my past losses had grown. As I washed the dishes, my phone buzzed. A message from him. "Hey, sorry I've been distant. Things are just a little unstable for me right now." I stared at the screen, heart steady, mind clear. I knew exactly what he was asking for, even if he hadn't asked yet. And for the first time in my life, the answer wasn't complicated. It was already inside me. The only question left was whether I would say it out loud or betray myself one last time for the illusion of connection. I didn't respond to his message right away. Not because I was playing games, but because I was listening to my breath, to my body, to the part of me that had learned the hard way that urgency is often a trap disguised as intimacy. Things are just a little unstable for me right now. I read it again slowly. Unstable had once been my cue to step in, to offer reassurance, solutions, money, space, whatever would smooth the moment. Instability used to activate my savior reflex like muscle memory. But now, instead of leaning forward, I leaned back, and I asked myself something new. Is this my responsibility? The answer came without debate. No. I typed a response, erased it, typed another, erased that too. Finally, I sent the simplest truth I could stand behind. I hope things work out for you. That was it. No follow-up question, no offer, no emotional padding. The reply didn't come. Hours passed, then a day, then two. And with each stretch of silence, I felt something unfamiliar but powerful take root, trust in my own restraint. I hadn't been cruel. I hadn't been cold. I had simply refused to turn someone else's instability into my burden. That night, I slept deeply. No tossing, no replaying conversations, no anxiety looping through my chest. Peace came easier when I didn't betray myself during the day. The following week, my coworker, the one who'd asked to borrow rent money, thanked me quietly for listening, even though I'd said no. She'd figured something else out. Life had gone on. Another reminder, saying no doesn't end the world. It clarifies it. With each boundary, my life felt more spacious, less crowded with expectations that weren't mine. I started to notice how much energy I used to spend anticipating other people's needs, and how much of that energy I now had for myself. I enrolled in a free financial literacy workshop offered through a local community center, not because I needed the basics anymore, but because I wanted language, frameworks, confirmation that what I'd lived through had a name and that others were untangling the same lessons. That's where I first heard the phrase that would stay with me. Financial compatibility is not income, it's about responsibility. It hit me square in the chest. Compatibility, not chemistry, not attraction, not potential, responsibility. I started reframing my past relationships through that lens, and the clarity was brutal. I had mistaken charm for consistency, promises for plans, apologies for change. And worst of all, I had mistaken my willingness to endure as proof of love. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. My savings grew, slowly, steadily. I celebrated quietly when I crossed another milestone, not with shopping, not with splurging, but with relief, with the knowledge that I was building something no one could take from me. One evening, scrolling through social media, I saw a photo of him, my ex, smiling, new haircut, new girlfriend, caption about new beginnings. Old me would have spiraled. Old me would have questioned her worth against mine. Old me would have wondered why I wasn't enough. This time, I felt nothing. Not bitterness, not jealousy, just distance. Because I finally understood that some people move on easily because they never carried the weight to begin with. The weight had been mine, and now it wasn't. I closed the app and went back to my spreadsheet, back to my plans, back to the life I was deliberately constructing. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small women's group, nothing official, just a circle of folding chairs and honest conversations. They wanted me to talk about money and relationships, about boundaries, about lessons learned. I hesitated. Speaking publicly meant naming what I'd survived. It meant admitting how deeply I'd been trapped, not by him alone, but by beliefs I'd absorbed and never questioned. It meant vulnerability in a new way. But something in me was ready, because my story wasn't just about heartbreak anymore. It was about awakening. The night before the meeting, I stood in front of the mirror practicing what I might say. I looked at myself, really looked, and saw a woman who had lost everything and chosen to rebuild with intention instead of resentment. I smiled. Tomorrow I would speak, not as a victim, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who learned the cost of confusing love with sacrifice and refused to pay it ever again. Still, I knew that telling the story out loud would open a door I hadn't fully stepped through yet, because once you say the truth publicly, it stops being something you survived quietly and starts becoming something you're responsible for passing on, whether I was ready or not. The room smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. That's the first thing I noticed when I walked in, how ordinary everything felt for a moment that was about to change me. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, a small table with pamphlets no one had touched yet, women filtering in slowly, greeting each other with nods and tired smiles. I almost turned around, not because I didn't have something to say, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way journaling never did. Once spoken, the story couldn't be edited. It couldn't be softened. It would belong to the room. I took a seat, hands folded tightly in my lap, listening as the facilitator welcomed everyone. She introduced me simply. Maya is here to talk about money, relationships, and boundaries. No dramatic buildup, no warning, just truth. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. My legs felt steady, even though my chest buzzed with nerves. I looked around the circle and saw pieces of myself everywhere. Women who'd carried too much, waited too long, paid more than their share in ways no one ever reimbursed. I thought love meant sacrifice, I began. The words landed heavier than I expected. Heads nodded, eyes lifted, pens stilled. I thought patience was proof. I thought if I just held things together long enough, everything would work out. I told them about the bills, the eviction notice, sleeping in my car. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. When I talked about how quiet shame is, how it convinces you to smile while your life collapses, a woman across from me wiped her eyes. I kept telling myself it was temporary, I said, but what I didn't realize was that I was the only one paying for the future I believed in. The room was silent in that sacred way, not awkward, not heavy, just listening. Then the questions came. How did you know when it crossed the line? Is it wrong to help someone you love? What if you already feel stuck? I answered slowly, carefully, honestly. It crosses the line when your help becomes expected. It's not wrong to help, it's dangerous to disappear. And feeling stuck doesn't mean you are, it means you need information. That last one surprised even me. After the meeting, women lingered, conversations stretched, stories spilled. One woman pulled me aside and whispered, "I thought I was being supportive. I didn't realize I was being drained." Another said, "No one ever talks about money like this." I drove home that night with my heart full and sore at the same time. Purpose has that effect. It stretches you. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked different, not physically, but energetically, like someone who'd stepped into alignment instead of survival. That night, I slept with the kind of rest that doesn't come from exhaustion, but from truth finally shared. The next few weeks, word spread quietly. Another group invited me, then another. Small rooms, modest gatherings, but the impact was real. Each time I spoke, I felt less exposed and more anchored. I wasn't reliving the pain, I was contextualizing it. I started refining my message, not blaming men, not demonizing love, but naming patterns, how financial imbalance erodes respect, how silence protects exploitation, how boundaries don't kill intimacy, they protect it. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, a young woman approached me. "My boyfriend keeps saying we'll figure it out," she said, "but I'm the only one with a plan." That sentence felt familiar in my bones. Plans without action are just hope, I told her gently, and hope shouldn't cost you your future. She nodded slowly, like something had clicked. Driving home, I realized something profound. I had stopped asking why this happened to me and started asking how I could use it. My heartbreak had become information. My loss had become language. My clarity had become something transferable. But growth doesn't stop testing you just because you're doing well. The more visible I became, the more opportunities and temptations began to appear. Some flattering, some dangerous, some offering shortcuts wrapped in validation. And soon I'd be faced with a choice that looked nothing like my past, but carried the same underlying question. Would I protect the life I was building even when the risk was dressed up as opportunity, or would I mistake attention for alignment and pay for it later? Opportunity has a way of testing your integrity when you least expect it. It came in the form of an email, polished, enthusiastic, flattering in all the ways that make you pause before asking questions. A women's empowerment brand had come across my story through a community group. They loved my message, loved my voice, loved my authenticity. They wanted to collaborate. At first, I felt honored, seen. validated, all the words that hit that tender place in people who rebuilt themselves quietly, without applause. They proposed workshops, speaking engagements, branded content. They talked about reach and impact and changing lives. Then I read the fine print. They wanted me to promote their financial coaching program, one that required upfront fees most of the women I spoke to could never afford. The language was slippery. Promises without guarantees, success stories without transparency, hope packaged as a product. My stomach tightened. I asked questions about certifications, about outcomes, about refunds. The responses were friendly but vague, reassuring without being specific, the same tone I'd heard before, just in a different context. We believe mindset is everything. Our clients just need to commit. Transformation requires investment. Those phrases rang alarms I couldn't ignore. This was the same logic that once convinced me to keep paying bills that weren't mine, the same framing that turned sacrifice into virtue and consequences into character flaws. I imagined standing in front of a room of women, telling them to protect their futures, then handing them something that might quietly drain it. The thought made my chest ache. I declined, politely, firmly, without apology. The response was immediate, disappointment disguised as confusion. They reminded me how much exposure I'd get, how this could accelerate my impact, how rare opportunities like this were. I closed the email and didn't reopen it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, my table, in my apartment, paid for with stability, and let the weight of that choice settle. It would have been easier to say yes, easier to let flattery override discernment, easier to tell myself I deserved the shortcut. But easy is what almost ruined me. The next morning, I woke up proud, not because I'd done something big, but because I'd done something aligned. I had protected my values the same way I protected my finances now, carefully, intentionally, without rushing. Word of mouth kept my work growing, slowly and sustainably. No hype, no pressure, just trust built on honesty. Women returned to my workshops and brought friends. Conversations deepened. The questions changed. How do I talk about money early in a relationship? What boundaries should exist before moving together? How do I leave without destroying myself financially? Those questions told me everything. I started developing simple tools, checklists, conversation starters, red flag frameworks. Nothing flashy, just practical, grounded, real. I tested them in workshops, refined them based on feedback, watched confidence grow in real time. One evening, after a session, a woman hugged me tightly and said, "You saved me years." I corrected her gently. "You saved yourself. I just helped you see it sooner." Driving home, I thought about how close I'd come to mistaking opportunity for progress, how easy it is to repeat old patterns when they show up as success instead of love. Growth doesn't erase temptation, it sharpens your response to it. As my life settled into something solid and mine, I felt something else emerge. A sense of responsibility, not to rescue anyone, but to tell the truth clearly, consistently, without dilution. Because silence had cost me everything once. I wasn't willing to let anyone else pay for their future. Still, as fulfilling as this work was, something lingered beneath the surface, a final reckoning I hadn't fully faced yet. Not with him, not with money, not with opportunity, but with myself. Because true closure doesn't come from walking away from what hurt you. It comes from forgiving the part of you that didn't know better and deciding who you'll be now that you do. And that moment of reckoning was closer than I realized. Forgiveness is not a feeling. It's a decision you make over and over again when the memory resurfaces and tries to rewrite the story with shame at the center. For a long time, I thought forgiving myself meant pretending I should have known better. But that kind of forgiveness is just punishment dressed up as wisdom. Real forgiveness starts with honesty. One quiet Sunday morning, coffee cooling on the table, I opened my journal to the first pages, the ones from the beginning. The frantic entries, the guilt-laced questions, the pages where I kept asking what was wrong with me. I read them slowly, and instead of cringing, I felt compassion. That woman didn't fail. She loved with the tools she had. She survived with the beliefs she was taught. She did not deserve to lose everything to learn a lesson. I wrote a sentence that would change how I spoke to myself forever. I didn't know, and now I do. That was it. No punishment, no excuses, just truth. Around that time, my life reached a quiet milestone. I signed a lease renewal without anxiety, paid a bill without checking my balance twice, added to my savings without panic. Stability had stopped feeling fragile. It felt earned. With that came a deeper confidence, not loud, not performative, but embodied. I no longer needed to convince anyone of my strength. I lived it in my decisions. I noticed how differently I showed up in conversations now. When friends vented about relationships that felt familiar, I listened without trying to fix. I asked questions that invited reflection instead of offering solutions. I let people sit with their own realizations. That restraint was new and powerful. One evening, a woman from one of my workshops asked if I'd consider turning my materials into a formal curriculum. She said, "This isn't just advice, it's education." The word stuck. Education, not motivation, not inspiration. Education protects. I started outlining lessons, practical, honest, rooted in lived experience. Love and money, boundaries and power, red flags that don't scream but whisper, how to leave with dignity, how to rebuild without bitterness. As I worked, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't teaching from a wound anymore. I was teaching from a scar. And scars don't ache the way wounds do. Late one night, I stepped out onto my balcony, city lights humming below. I thought about how far I'd come, not in years, but in identity. I was no longer the woman who paid to be loved. I was the woman who required reciprocity. That shift changed everything. I checked my phone and saw an unfamiliar number, a voicemail notification. I hesitated before listening. It was him. Not angry, not apologetic, nostalgic. He talked about memories, about growth, about how he never meant for things to turn out that way. He said he hoped I was doing well. I didn't feel pulled. I didn't feel tempted. I felt complete. I deleted the voicemail, not out of spite, out of clarity, because closure doesn't require a conversation when you've already answered the question within yourself. That night, I slept deeply, without dreams. The next morning, I woke up knowing the final chapter of this story wasn't about what I survived. It was about what I stood for now, and the way I would pass that forward, clearly, confidently, without apology, would be the true measure of how far I'd come. There was only one part left to tell, and it would bring everything full circle. The first time someone introduced me as an expert, I almost corrected them. We were standing in a modest community room, beige walls, stacked chairs, a whiteboard with faint marker stains that never fully disappear. The facilitator smiled and said, "This is Maya. She is here to talk to us about financial boundaries in relationships." Expert wasn't the word she used, but it's what I felt ripple through the room. Women looked at me differently now, not with pity, not with concern, but with expectation. They expected clarity, direction, truth. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. It grounded me. I spoke without notes that day, not because I had memorized anything, but because the lessons lived in my body now. I talked about how financial traps don't start with contracts. They start with language, with phrases like, just for now, we're a team, I'll get you back, don't worry about it. I watched recognition spread across faces like sunrise. I told them how love shouldn't require you to shrink your future to sustain someone else's present, how support becomes sabotage when accountability is missing, how patience can be weaponized against the very person offering it. No one interrupted. Afterward, women stayed behind, forming a loose semicircle like they weren't ready to leave the safety of shared understanding. One woman said, I thought I was being loyal. Another whispered, I thought I was selfish for wanting stability. I shook my head gently. You weren't selfish, I said. You were uninformed, and that's fixable. That word again, fixable. On my way home, I sat in traffic longer than usual, letting the day settle. I thought about how long I'd believed my story was one of failure, how I'd internalized loss as proof that I wasn't discerning enough, strong enough, worthy enough. Now I saw it differently. I hadn't failed. I had been initiated. That night, I pulled out all my old financial documents, the ones I'd kept neatly organized but emotionally distant from, the eviction notice, the overdraft letters, the final statements from accounts that once held my sense of security. I spread them across my table and looked at them without flinching. They didn't define me anymore. They documented a turning point. I shredded what no longer served me, filed what I needed, let go of what had already taught its lesson. When I was done, the table was clear, and so was my chest. The following weeks brought quiet confirmation that I was on the right path, a raise at work, an invitation to consult on a women's financial wellness program, messages from women who'd left relationships more safely because of something I said. I never told them what to do. I taught them how to see. One evening, as I updated my materials, I paused over a section titled Red Flags That Don't Look Red at First. I smiled to myself. That had been my blind spot for so long, mistaking calm for safety, charm for consistency, need for love. I changed the heading, Questions Worth Asking Early, because fear-based language had never helped me heal. Curiosity had. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, not worn, but seasoned, softer in some places, stronger in others. A woman who had stopped performing resilience and started embodying it. I realized then that the shame I once carried had fully released its grip, not because I proved anything, but because I stopped asking for permission to prioritize myself. Still, there was one final step left. Not a workshop, not a lesson, not another boundary. A declaration, something I needed to say, not to him, not to anyone else, but to the version of myself who once believed love was supposed to hurt, cost, and deplete. And I knew that when I said it, this chapter of my life would truly close. I said it out loud one morning while standing in my kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter like it had something to prove. I will never bankrupt myself to be loved. The words didn't echo, they didn't shake the walls, but they settled deep. The kind of settling that feels permanent, like something finally locking into place. That sentence wasn't bitterness, it wasn't anger, it was alignment. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who paid bills with hope, who confused endurance with devotion, who believed love required proof in the form of sacrifice. I didn't judge her anymore. I honored her for surviving long enough to learn better. My life didn't become extravagant after that. It became intentional. Bills paid on time, savings growing slowly, sleep that came without anxiety, peace that didn't depend on anyone else's behavior. I stopped explaining my boundaries, stopped shrinking my standards, stopped apologizing for choosing stability. Love, I learned, should feel safe, not suspenseful, not draining, not conditional on how much you're willing to lose. The women I taught began teaching others. Conversations spread. Quiet warnings passed from sister to sister. Red flags were named earlier. Questions were asked sooner. Futures were protected before they had to be rebuilt. That was the real victory, not my recovery, but the ripple. Sometimes I think back to the eviction notice, to the car, to the silence that followed when I finally stopped paying for someone else's comfort. I don't flinch anymore. Those memories don't hurt. They inform. Because heartbreak didn't break me, loss didn't erase me, and love, real love, never asks for your future as collateral. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself somewhere in my story, hear me clearly. You are not selfish for wanting security. You are not cold for asking questions, and you are not disloyal for choosing yourself. You are wise, and wisdom changes everything. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I truly love to know.